Welcome back to 40 Videos. I'm your reviewer, Professor Pretentious, and today we are reviewing Strange Harvest, written and directed by Stuart Ortiz. And in this film, we follow a slick documentary that might have been found on Netflix if not for the overtly gruesome images in it. Two detectives and other interviewees trace the history of the Mr. Shiny murders across decades in San Bernardino. I have to say I was relatively disappointed by this film. I bought into the hype of the trailers and the early reviews of it. I'm familiar with Stuart Ortiz from his moniker of the Vicious Brothers, who were making films in the early 2000s. Us horror fans in the early 2000s had very few options for novel horror, with the mainstream bogged down by possession movies, torture porn, and remakes, and nothing in between. So when young American filmmakers like Ty West, Simon Barrett, David Bruckner, Adam Wingard, and Radio Silence came along, we ate that up like horror caviar. In retrospect, most of the films were flawed, but it was the fresh air that we needed to survive a very, very stale and suffocating time for horror. The new American horror movement's critical and audience success directly contributed to the mid-budget horror revival helmed by Blumhouse, A24, Neon, and horror streaming services such as Screambox or Shudder. For that, I'm mainly grateful. I'm bound to thank you for it. Writer-director Stuart Ortiz is most famous for his collaboration with Colin Minihan for the Grave Encounters movies. This is the early example of the Ghost Hunters Gone Wrong subgenre of found footage movies. It had a dedicated following in the early 2000s. In my opinion, the movies were mid to unremarkable, sometimes downright terrible. So there was a lot of room for improvement with Stuart Ortiz's individual film. And Strange Harvest does make some improvements to Grave Encounters. It's focused, grotesque, and has a unity of symbols that converge in a somewhat satisfying conclusion. However, so much of this film is shaped by its concept that my opinion of it depends on how successful I feel its realist form is. So a lot of this review is going to be me looking at how successful its realist format is. So we lump these types of movies into the found footage format. However, the distinction between found footage and the mockumentary is in the role of the filmmaker. In found footage, the director is meant to be merely a compiler, less of a fly on the wall than simply a ghost or a projectionist, whereas in a mockumentary, the director is intentionally compiling, or at the most, a mockumentary is a scrupulously curated film. The genre of Strange Harvest can't really be called found footage and is far more fitting in the mockumentary format. For a genre that is so played out by 2025, something about a mockumentary horror really needs to earn that format by either creating a variant of it or commenting on the nature of that format. This modern variant style of the mockumentary might be found in what we call the screen life format, while the commentary on the mockumentary might be in what I'll call the exploitation style of found footage or mockumentary. The screen life format has its roots roughly about 15 years ago, with the utterly horrific Megan is Missing movie. Other ones that I found slightly more successful, or rather just palatable movies, are The Den, Unfriended, Searching, and the newer one, Host. It can be hard to make screen life work, because, just turn off the computer or phone. But these films seem most successful to me because they either work directly within the limitations of the format, without fudging it at all, or they use the format to explore the fears of exposure, anonymity, and increased interdependence that are born from 21st century technology. These forms are right now in danger of being fully played out and in need of a new reinvention. In my opinion, one of the most successful variations on found footage comes from the creepypastas that exist online. They really show a new element, a new subtlety and abstraction that can come from this type of horror, which makes something a little bit more traditional seem kind of banal. Now, the next variation is the exploitation mockumentary. This one is helmed largely by the classic Belgian film Man Bites Dog, one of my personal favorites, Leslie Vernon, or The Rise and Fall of Leslie Vernon, and Deadstream. The exploitation mockumentary form goes beyond simply documenting horror. This genre provides a second dimension of meta-commentary, where the documentarian is complicit in the violence that they themselves are capturing. This type opens itself up to satire, often very dark satire, and other explorations of voyeurism and objectification. It's really inherent in what we've learned about how documentary and reality television tend to be made in the 21st century. To me, what makes the two modern genres of the exploitation mockumentary and the screen life found footage interesting is the fact that they're not presented as complete or controlled realities. They're not a neatly, slickly produced documentary. They play with the idea of an objective truth or a controlled narrative by altering the trajectory of the project through its discoveries as it's being made. However, the straight mockumentary is a touchstone of American filmmaking, in large part because of how obsessed we are with voyeurism as its own form of exploitation in a capitalist filmmaking medium. Now, we know this genre, it's deep in our bones, from Orson Welles' F for Fake and his version of The War of the Worlds, to David Holtzman's Diary, to Christopher Guest's and Sacha Baron Cohen's comedies. The early 90s brought us the McPherson tapes and Ghost Watch as the progenitors of the horror mockumentary, which reached its peak in the imitable form of The Blair Witch Project in 1999. In recent years, we've seen two films that Strange Harvest evokes. The first is the Poughkeepsie Tapes, which is a harrowing descent into a serial murder snuff collection in documentary form. Whereas the other, Late Night with the Devil, explores the falsity of show business horror, ending with a singular demonic exposure. Strange Harvest merges the two of these films into one. Now, for me, the oldest one, the straight mockumentary, requires the most reinvention to be successful. It's been around for almost 70 years. Strange Harvest doesn't do any of this. In an age where the true crime documentary is the most oversaturated form of reality television, particularly the murder documentary, a movie really needs to make it novel to maintain my attention. Strange Harvest doesn't really do any of this. One of the things that bothers me about this movie is that it falls into the self-conscious exploitation trap, in which the making of the film or the lionizing of the serial killer itself becomes part of the problem and the commentary that the film is making. With the prominence of Ryan Murphy's semi-ghoulish murder biopics, particularly the Jeffrey Dahmer one, the obsession with serial murder has gone far beyond exploitation. I had my time in my 20s doing research into files, in particular the Bay Area murders and serial killings of the 1970s. I had my interest, I had my obsession. I looked into the face of evil and wanted to learn about it. I also moved on at some point. I'm not a staunch moralist, but I have to say, a film or a series of films can't spend the predominance of its runtime focusing on the murderer and the grisly details and gore, and then try to save face by bemoaning the public focus on reifying the focus on the criminal over the victims. The movie tries to do this near the end, pointing out how the victims' names should be remembered over the serial killer's name and deeds. But the whole entire movie that we've watched before this betrays that ideal. Now, in a mockumentary, this desire to focus more on the victims can be done by either focusing more on character, which in this case would be either the detective or the victims. Now, Strange Harvest doesn't do this. It keeps it broad and shallow without any real time dedicated to learning about anybody personally. Since we're so familiar with this format, the moments of artifice are more prominent than ever. So, the lurid gore and crime scene photos are obviously for the horror film viewer. They're for us hardcore viewers. These documentaries in real life will include blood splatters or disheveled rooms, maybe even obscured parts of dead bodies, but the detail with which they document the gore and the length of time they spend on it in such a slick documentary form feels inauthentic in a way that questions the use of the format altogether. As a viewer addressing that question, we're left either to forgive the misstep or have the choice invalidate the film altogether. I find myself in the latter camp. Personally, it took me out of it, which just made me wish that they hadn't used the format altogether and just had made a straight fiction. So the problem becomes when you commit to that, then it begins to shape the narrative in a way that might appear false or forged in some way. Now, it might seem unfair to criticize a movie for the things that it doesn't do, but there's a lot I feel like this film needed to do in order to make it effective. So, without any improvement on the mockumentary genre, particularly the horror mockumentary genre, what we're left with are some horrific kills and gore and a moderately compelling plot trajectory. But now, if you've connected the dots, we're veering into some very familiar Longlegs territory. With the serial killer plot, some great gore, a compelling plot trajectory, and some mysticism thrown in just in case we missed the other side of the aisle. And the positives of Longlegs largely rely on elements this film doesn't have: cinematography, dialogue, and its performances. A mockumentary is quite limited by its conceit in general, and this one doesn't provide notable cinematography, doesn't include much dialogue, and by virtue of the compiled nature of the film, it throws out all the usual tropes of the serial killer film and the mockumentary and conveys them serviceably, but without any twists, it remains a mundane scarefest. Perhaps it's my own flaw as a viewer to expect something new from the genre, but I can't abide by a merely decent mockumentary horror film anymore. So, sitting on this film for months and then releasing it the same weekend as the hyped up juggernaut that is Weapons, which is not to mention a superior film, but bound to be a higher grosser, really won't do Strange Harvest many favors. So, go see Strange Harvest if you like gruesome police procedurals, or don't, because there are dozens and dozens of better crime documentaries, mockumentaries, and found footage films out there that did it far more compellingly than this movie did. It's fine. Thanks for watching. I'm Professor Pretentious. See you in the next review. Bye.